Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Tina Helmuth. I'm a Celtic expert and I've made it my life's mission to share information about the Celts, insights into the Celtic mindset with people who are interested in who their ancestors were and who these amazing, mysterious people who at one point occupied most of Central Europe, what they actually were like. So today I thought I'd share something really special with you, a very, very old ghost story. It's a Celtic ghost story, of course, and it's the oldest ghost story from north of the Alps. Of course, the Romans and the Greeks and also the Egyptians, they had ghost stories, even in the antique, but north of the Alps, we don't really know what people listened to, what stories they had, because the Celtic culture was an oral culture. And the first time we hear anything directly from Celtic mouth, so to speak, is when writing was introduced in Ireland. So this is also the first Irish ghost story. It's over 1,000 years old, and maybe not surprisingly, it's set at Samain, which we know as Halloween nowadays, the night to the 1st of November. And that's the scariest time in the Celtic calendar, of course, because it's the transition from bright summer to dark winter. And this story is over 1,000 years old, and I thought I'd share it with you because it's actually a really great story. So sit back and enjoy. The story itself is called Nera. Nera is the genitive of the name Nera, and it's the adventures of a guy called Nera. Okay, so Nera is the name of this ancient Celtic ghost story. It was a dark and hostile night, this last night of October. It was a special night which marked the end of bright, golden, beautiful, bountiful summer and the beginning of dark, dreary, dreaded winter. For the next few months, the small island in the middle of the Atlantic would be beaten by the vicious storms moving in from the west. People would come together in their houses, mend their tools, and spin and weave, and listen to stories about the ancient past, about the heroes, and at Samhain, of course, also to stories that happened at Samhain. On this particular Samhain night, even the moon was hiding behind the thick layer of dark clouds. The royal stronghold at Ráith Cruachan, which is in Connacht in the west of Ireland, was the royal fortress of the king and queen of Connacht. That's King Ailill and Queen Medb. They were known to be very hospitable, and not surprisingly, the entire royal household and anybody who was within travelling distance of the household that night had come there to spend the scariest night of the year in the safety of Ráith Cruachan. And while the men and the ladies of the royal household and their guests were waiting for their food, the men were showing off to the ladies, boasting of all the wonderful things they had been doing, or their deeds and adventures. And at some point, everybody became silent because King Ailill himself had stood up and said, raising his hand, "Men, just listen for a moment." And he looked around in the rushes on the floorboards until he found what he was looking for. And he bent down and he picked up a longish, bendy twig. And he said to the men and women looking eagerly up to him, he said, "Now men, I have a special challenge for you. Whoever goes out to the makeshift gallows that we put up earlier today," and remember we hung 2 men there and they're still out there. Now whoever goes out to them and takes this bendy twig and ties it around the foot of one of these men, he can have whatever wish granted he wants. The men looked at each other and it was clear what they were thinking. Nice challenge, but really going out in this weather on this night alone to 2 dead men? But suddenly somebody jumped up, and it was a little red-headed warrior, and he said, "I'll do it, I'll do it, I'll do it." And he ran up to the king and grabbed the twig out of his hand and belted out the door, leaving the door open so the gusts of wind and rain came in before anybody even realized what was happening. And just as quickly, he was back, bedraggled looking, wet, the twig still in his hand. A big warrior from the king's guard himself was next. He said, "Let me." And he walked up to the little shamefaced looking red-headed warrior, and he took the twig from out of his hand, looked at him pityingly, and walked out the door, slamming it shut behind him. The minutes passed. The door opened. A wet warrior walked in the door, twig still in hand, threw the twig down and disappeared into a corner. But that was it. Now everybody wanted to go. The men were falling over themselves, each grabbing the twig, running out, coming back very quickly, and in the end, it looked as if nobody was going to do it. And King Ailill was about to call off the contest. A young man called Nera, who'd been sitting in the corner watching the entire thing, stood up and he said, "I'll do it." And as he was walking up to the king who held the twig, he put on his armor, he took his weapons and the twig. Well equipped, he walked out, closed the door behind him. After he'd walked for a few steps, the warmth and safety and the hum of Ráith Cruachan had already become a distant memory. It was pitch black. Nera knew in which direction the gallows were because he had helped put them up himself, but still it was very hard to find anything in this pitch black night, so he had to have his hands actually finding his way so he wouldn't walk into anything. Just as he was coming to where he thought the gallows would be, the moon came out from behind the clouds for a moment, and he realized there they were, swinging violently in the wind, these two corpses that had been hung just a few hours previously. Nera walked up, and with his hand he felt to see could he actually find the foot of one of these swinging corpses. And in the end he managed to get hold of this ice cold foot with the left, and with the right he grabbed inside of his cloak and took out the twig, and he tried to fasten the twig around the foot of the corpse. He first wrapped this bendy twig around the foot, trying somehow to hook them together so it would stay, but it didn't. And he tried 3 times, and 3 times it kept opening again, until suddenly a hoarse voice from above spoke up. "You won't manage it like that. You need to take the spike from my cloak and tie them together like that." Nera, to his horror, realized that the voice came from the corpse whose very foot he was still holding. But then he thought, well, better 1 look ahead than 2 behind, and let go of the foot and started fumbling in the cloak of the corpse. And sure enough, there was a little spike with which he could then actually tie the bendy twig around the foot, and it held fast. "Well done, Nera," said the horrible voice from up high. "Well done yourself," said Nera, who was already feeling more courageous now that he had actually managed to do the challenge. "Now I challenge you," said the corpse. "By your warrior's honor, carry me on your back to where I can have a drink, because I was already thirsty when they hung me." Nera, who owed the corpse now, of course, at this stage, had no choice but to agree. So suddenly he felt the weight of the corpse on his back. "So where do you want to take me?" he asked the corpse. "To the nearest house," said the corpse. So Nera, with the corpse on his back, walked through the darkness towards the nearest house. As they got closer, they saw that the inhabitants had built up a huge circle of fire all around the house. It looked as if the house was in a lake of fire. "Not that one," said the corpse. "They always cover the hearth fire at night. Take me to the house that is nearest from here." So poor Nera had to keep on walking. As they came to the next house, they found that it was surrounded by an actual lake. "Not that one," said the corpse. "They never leave any water standing in any vessel, be it from bathing or from doing the washing. Take me to the house that is nearest from here." So Nera had to walk on again with the corpse on his back. When they came to the third house, the corpse was finally satisfied. He slid off Nera's back and walked straight up the path and through the front door. In the house, there was a bucket of dirty water from washing, a pail with wastewater from the kitchen, and a large tub with used bath water. The corpse drank from all of these containers. Then he went to the sleeping inhabitants and splashed some of this water onto their faces. They died instantly. And that is why no dirty water from washing or bathing should be left in the house after bedtime, and why no fire should ever be left uncovered. Now that his thirst was quenched, the corpse said, "Okay, I'm ready now. You can take me back to the gallows." So Nera once again took him on his back and walked all the way back to where the single corpse was swinging in the wind. And as he got closer, all of a sudden the load was gone and the corpse back on the gallows. As Nera then turned around to walk back towards Ráith Cruachan, eager to tell everybody about how well he had done, he realized that there was a glow in the distance where the stronghold was. And as he got closer, he realized that the fortress had been set ablaze in his absence. And he could also make out a vast army and a mound that hadn't been there before. As Nera got closer, he realized that the mound was in fact the heads of many of the Connacht men and women that had been in the royal fortress that night. Nera was contemplating what to do. He was unsure because he realized that the host was assembling and he needed to act somehow. So he made a speedy decision. "A light in front of you is better than 7 behind," he said to himself, and he joined the long line of men who were on their way back into the Otherworld cave of Cruachan. The last man noticed Nera and said to the man in front of him, "There's someone on our tail." To which the other replied, "That's why the tail is heavier." He then told the man in front of him, and so on and so forth, so the word travelled to the very front of the line. But by the time it had reached the front, the entire host had already walked into the cave of Cruachan and was now inside the sheath. Soon the king, of course, heard about this intruder, and he said, "Bring him to me. I want to meet this guy." So Nera was made to go up towards the king, which he did rather reluctantly, as you can imagine. Once Nera stood in front of the king just asked, "Why did you come into the sheath with my men?" To which Nera, who didn't really have an answer, replied, "I escorted the army." To his surprise, the king seemed satisfied with this answer and said simply, "Okay, then go to that house down there, and there's a woman living there, and knock at the door, and when she opens, tell her that I send you, and she will make you welcome. But there's one thing you need to do, which is you're going to have to bring me firewood every day." Nera said, "Yeah, I can do that," and turned and walked towards the house the king had indicated. He knocked at the door, and the door opened, and Nera saw the most beautiful woman he had ever seen standing in front of him. She was dressed in a green cloak, and her long blonde hair was fastened on her head with a braid. And she didn't say anything, just looked at him inquiringly. And Nera, who thought, well, maybe this is not a place for long explanations, just said, "The king sent me, and he said you'd make me welcome." And the woman answered, "So I will." stepped back and let him into the house. The next morning, Nera chopped some firewood, put it on his back and walked to the king's court. He did the same thing the next day, and that day he realized something that he had noticed the day before, but which seemed to be a regular occurrence, and that was that just as he was entering the court, two men were leaving the court. Now these weren't two ordinary men. One of them was blind and the other one was lame, and the blind one was carried by the lame man on his back. And Nera got curious and he thought, what is with these two men? So he decided to follow them. And he didn't have far to go, because they only walked as far as the spring near the entrance of the king's court. And once they got to the entrance, a very curious conversation happened between the two men. "Is it there?" the blind man would ask. "Yes, indeed it is," the lame man would answer. "So let's go back then," which is what they did. Nera was understandably intrigued by this event, and as he got back home, he asked the lady he was living with about it. He said, "Why do these two men, the blind and the lame one, why do they visit the spring?" "They don't actually visit the spring, but the crown that's in it," was the answer. Now that didn't help Nera much, right? He looked confused, so the young woman added, "It's a golden headdress that belongs to the king, and the spring is where it's kept." Nera was still not satisfied. "But why these two men?" And the young woman answered, "That's because he had them specially entrusted with this, because since one is blind and the other one is lame, neither of the two can steal the crown on their own, so they can only go there together, so the crown is safe." "I have another question," said Nera. "Could you explain to me something else that has happened since I've been here?" "What is that?" asked the woman. "As I was walking into the Shees the other day, I got the distinct impression that Ráith Cruachan had been set ablaze and that the king and queen of Connacht had been killed, together with their entire household." The woman smiled and said, "Well, that is actually our magic. The fact is that it hasn't happened yet, but that it will happen, unless you tell the Connacht people what you saw here." Nera jumped up and he said, "I have to warn them then. How do I do that? What do I need to do?" "Just go back to them," was the simple answer. "And when you go back there, you will find them sitting just like they were before, around the same cauldron, still waiting for the food to be prepared." Nera couldn't believe it. I mean, hadn't he just spent 3 days and 3 nights in their Shees, and now she's telling him that this time hadn't actually happened? But there was no time for him to dwell on this, because the woman continued, "Tell your companions to be on guard this next Samhain night and make sure that they are the ones raiding the Shees." Nera said, "That's all very well, but how can I get them to believe me? How can I get them to understand that I've actually been here inside the Shees?" And the woman said, "That's very easy. You just have to take some of the fruits of summer with you." So Nera went out and he got some wild garlic and some buttercups and some primroses, and he tucked them safely inside of his tunic. And then he walked back to the woman to bid her farewell. And just as he was turning to leave, the woman said, "There's one more thing that you need to know, and that is, I am pregnant with your son. So I have one request. Just before the men of Connacht come to raid the Shees next Samhain night, come here and warn me so I can bring your son and your cattle to safety." Nera promised this, and then he turned round and he simply walked out of the Shees. As he entered Ráith Cruachan, he found the men and women of the royal household alive and well, and just like the woman had described, still waiting around the boiling kettle. And they were really pleased to see him and greeted him back, and were very pleased to hear that he had finally actually achieved what he had set out to do, which was to tie the twig around the corpse's foot. But they were even more amazed when he told them about his other adventures. Of course, they didn't want to believe him first, until he reached into his tunic and he took out the wild garlic, the primroses and the buttercups, proving that he had in fact been to the land of eternal summer. So when the next Samhain night came along, King Ailill went up to Nera and he said, now it's time for us to raid the sheaths, so you had better do what you have to do. So Nera went the same way he had walked the previous year and found the woman already waiting for him, and she had everything packed up, and she said to him, just one thing, you're going to have to go to the king and deliver your firewood, because for the last year I've been doing it, and I think he's getting a bit impatient now with me. So Nera said, okay, fair enough, put the firewood onto his back and walked into the king's court with it. And the king was really pleased to see him and said, I'm delighted to see that you have obviously recovered from your long illness, but I am a bit annoyed with you nevertheless, because I never gave you consent to sleep with that woman, and yet I have to congratulate you on the birth of a healthy baby boy. So Nera said, I understand, you can do with me as you see fit. And the king, he looked at Nera and thought, the lad has been punished enough, he's only just recovered from a nasty illness. So he said, look, let's just forget about it, okay? No real harm done. And Nera went away with the king's blessing. The small family left the sheaths just in time through a back door as the king and queen of Connacht, Ailill and Medb, entered the sheath through the front entrance to raid it, which is what they did, and very thoroughly. But after that, the small family went back into the sheaths, where they lived happily ever after. And that is the end of this ghost story, which I personally like very much, and I hope you enjoyed this too. If you did, please give me the thumb up, and also share this video with anybody who might also enjoy this, and please sign up to my channel so I can notify you when I release my next video. Until then, be safe, slán.